Good afternoon and welcome to a very special Supreme Court Historical Society program today as we continue to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Society with a program devoted to the founder of our Society, Chief Justice Warren E. Burger. And we're going to talk about his vision for the Judiciary. I'm Jim Duff. I'm the Executive Director of the Society, and joining me today are two stalwarts of the Society throughout its history. Clare Cushman is our Director of Publications, and Carter Phillips is our newly appointed President of the Society, who has served in various other capacities on the Society's board for many years. Each of the three of us has had a special and close working relationship with Chief Justice Burger, and each of us have insights into three aspects of Chief Justice Burger's tenure as Chief Justice that we know were important to him. Number one, of course, is his attention to the cases brought before the court. Second, was his interest in preserving the history of the court. And third, his attention to court administration throughout the judicial branch. Carter served as a law clerk to the Chief Justice in the October term 1978. He subsequently served as an assistant to the Solicitor General of the United States, and since then has led the appellate practice at Sidley and Austin. And I say led, he founded it and led it to great acclaim. All told, he has argued 90 cases before the court, including 9 before Chief Justice Burger while he was Chief Justice. Carter is one of the most experienced attorneys ever to appear before the court. Clare was hired by Chief Justice Burger to head the Society's publications and our Journal of Supreme Court History. She was hired in 1990 and has had a great perspective on Chief Justice Burger's interests in history and the origins of his founding of the Society. And I worked as a chambers aide to Chief Justice Burger from 1975 through 1979, and met Carter during this time, that time frame. And while I attended law school at Georgetown, I gained unique insight into Chief Justice Burger's work in the administrative arena of the courts, which also inspired and opened many opportunities to me later in my career. A theme you will see throughout our conversation today is Chief Justice Burger's work ethic, a phenomenal volume of work that he produced in a wide range of areas within the judicial branch. And after our initial conversation, we will be taking questions from the audience, and you can share your questions in the Q&A box on your Zoom window. So let's begin with a brief summary of Warren E. Burger's early years in Minnesota, where we see his capacity for work exhibited at an early age. And Clare, as our historian, that's a good place for us to start with the conversation with you, his Minnesota roots, his jobs, and so forth. And we'll go from there.
Thank you, Jim. Yeah, I'm going to get right into the formative years of Warren Burger. He was born on September 17th, 1907. So that was became Constitution Day. He spent the first few years of his life on a small farm outside of Stacy, Minnesota. Then the family moved when he was 3 or 4 to a truck farm outside of St. Paul, and eventually to the Dayton Bluff area of St. Paul when he was in 2nd grade. So this last home, which was on Conway Street, was an old schoolhouse and had neither electricity nor central heat. He was one of 7 children. His father, Charles Joseph, was a traveling salesman and also a railroad cargo inspector. Warren Burger was very proud of his grandfather, who fought for the Union Army when he was 14 with great distinction. He had come over from Austria. The Burger family's origins were Austrian. The family was not well off. The children were expected to contribute to the family expenses. When Burger was 11, he had a 7-mile paper route. When he was 8, he had contracted polio and spent a lot of time at home in bed. His teachers sent him books to read, mostly history books, and I think we can trace the origin of his love for history and champion of history to perhaps that episode. He enrolled in Johnson High School in St. Paul in 1922, and he excelled at art. He was very close to his art teacher, and he was particularly talented at sculpture. Jim Duff has on his desk a replica of a sculpture that he made of Benjamin Franklin, a bust. I would like to show it off.
To display. It's something I have proudly displayed in my office for many years. His son Wade Berger gave me this replica, and it's very valuable. And I didn't learn about the fact that he had sculpted this in high school until we started preparing for this program. And then I noticed on the back of the sculpture that it had the inscription, his signature, and JHS, Johnson High School, 1923 on the back. So I'm learning as we were going along here too. I also didn't know he had a 7-mile paper route. That's really quite remarkable. I had a paper route in my youth as well. I don't think I lasted as long as he did in his, but but it wasn't 7 miles long either.
So the other formative experience in his early boyhood years was his friendship with Harry Blackman that I just want to touch on briefly. They were tennis sparring partners and good friends, and Harry Blackman eventually served as the best man at Warren Burger's wedding. And when Blackman was appointed to the 8th Circuit and then to the Supreme Court, his old friend Warren Burger supported his candidacies. But I want to go back to high school to the other teacher who was very formative in his development, and that is Miss Edna Moore. She taught English and journalism and became an extremely influential figure in his life. When he was sworn in on the Court of Appeals and at the Supreme Court, she was present. He brought her there. And so interestingly enough, Burger wrote for the school newspaper. He covered sports. He would eventually become the editor of the school newspaper. And he worked as a stringer for the St. Paul Dispatch. So he earned money with the local newspaper, selling them stories. The other thing to know about high school is that is where he met Elvira Burger, called Vera. They didn't start courting until Burger had moved on to undergraduate life, and he attended the University of Minnesota at night. He enrolled in extension classes. He was working full-time during the day to support himself in the St. Paul office of the Mutual Life Insurance Company of New York, selling insurance. It was a very demanding life. He had to balance classes and work. He kept a diary when he was in law school, so 2 years of undergraduate, and then he moved on to the St. Paul College of Law, again, attending night classes, continuing to work during the day. He also lived at home, I should mention, until he finished law school to save money. So in this diary, which I really need to thank Leonora Berger, who's the Chief Justice's daughter-in-law, and his granddaughter, Annie, who have been very instrumental in preserving a lot of the artifacts about Warren Burger's life, not just at William and Mary, where his archive is, but in their home. So this diary really highlights the theme that Jim was mentioning, and that's about his work ethic. He was exhausted. It was very challenging to take on a full law school load and to work during the day. And he had some doubts about his abilities. He felt that he needed to outwork everybody in order to excel, and he was very ambitious. So he does graduate from law school magna cum laude in the spring of 1931 and marries. He had by that point married Vera. She was had been a teacher. She had trained as a teacher. And then the next part of his life is about being a working lawyer at a law firm in St. Paul. I'm just going to briefly touch on that. So he worked for a firm called Boys and Otis, Brill and Pharisee. Within 3 years, he made partner, but he also continued to teach contract law at his law school, the St. Paul College of Law. He was also very involved in the civic affairs of St. Paul, and he was very committed to civil rights. During World War II, Berger worked on the St. Paul Council of Human Relations, and he helped find homes for displaced Japanese American families. And one of these families lived with the Berger family for a year. He also served on the Minnesota Governor's Interracial Commission in the late 1940s and 50s. And so he was involved in the Republican Party and civic politics. So just quickly, now I want to move on, but I want to talk about how did someone from Berger's modest background with a Knight Law School degree from a regional law school manage to become Chief Justice? Very quickly, the key is the 1952 Republican National Convention. Berger was instrumental in delivering the delegates for Harold Stassen to Dwight D. Eisenhower. Berger had been a big supporter of Governor Stassen, and then when Eisenhower won the presidency, he rewarded Berger by bringing him to Washington to work for the Justice Department and head up its civil division. Berger's mentor there was Herbert Brownell, who eventually persuaded Eisenhower to appoint Berger to the DC Court of Appeals in 1956. And then in 1969, Richard Nixon chose Berger to succeed Earl Warren as Chief Justice.
Thank you, Claire, for that great summary. And it is interesting to contrast in some ways. It's interesting also that they had such a strong friendship in their youth of Justice Blackmun's path to the court with Chief Justice Berger's. And Blackmun, you might say, had a more traditional path in that he attended Harvard Law School. And then, as you pointed out, Chief Justice Berger had to work his way through school at night and stayed at home in St. Paul. But they both ended up on the court together, and it's a very interesting story.
Yes, Jim, sorry, can I just interject? I forgot to mention that Berger was actually admitted to Princeton. His beloved teacher, Edna Moore, helped him to get a partial scholarship, but it wasn't sufficient to cover his expenses, and he felt that he needed to stay home and take care of his family and his younger siblings.
Right, yeah, I was going to raise that too. So he did get accepted to Princeton, but couldn't attend for economic reasons. But we do see early on the work ethic and supporting his family, working his way through. And we'll see as we continue the conversation how this carried on throughout his career. His capacity for work was really quite remarkable. And that leads us to a discussion with Carter about the workload at the Supreme Court. And when Carter became a law clerk to Chief Justice Berger in 1978, we want to hear about Carter's path to that, but I'll just set it up by saying in those days, the court would hear an oral argument and write opinions on about 165 cases per year throughout the 1970s and early 80s. And you compare that with today's I say workload, I mean, the court is still receiving an increased number of petitions for cert every year, but the number of cases they're hearing in oral argument now is about 60 or 65 a year. So Carter, let's hear about your path through Chief Justice Berger's office and the workload and your observations about that as a law clerk, and then later into your career as an advocate before the court.
Well, I'll be quick about my path. I graduated from Northwestern and then went to clerk for Judge Robert Sprecher on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Seventh Circuit, and then applied. And interestingly, I had originally tried to get a job with Justice White, who interviewed me and turned me down pretty summarily, even before I got back to the hotel. But I parlayed that into an interview with Justice Powell. who also rejected me, but at least he did it because he had already allotted all 4 of his clerkships to someone else even before I had a chance to meet with him. But as I learned years later, he actually wrote a note to Chief Justice Berger encouraging the chief to take a hard look at me, which, the chief didn't actually interview law clerks as part of the hiring process. He had 4 of his former clerks who created a committee, and they would each interview 10 people. And I interviewed with Charlie Hobbs, one of his former clerks, as part of that process. And I was told that somehow between my conversation with Charlie and the note from Justice Powell, that put me at in the list of one of the 4. And so that's how I ended up becoming one of the chief's clerks. So I hadn't actually met him before I started working at the court. It was interesting to meet him, having, with the job in hand. I can talk later about how important he was to the rest of my career. But coming to the Supreme Court, I had been to one oral argument in my life. Previous to that, I'd gone the year before to watch an oral argument. I don't think it's easy to even kind of wrap your mind around the idea of what it means to get through 8,000 petitions for certiorari, which is about the number of requests that would come in a year. Try to get through all of that, deal with bench memos on all of the, on your 1/4 of the cases that were before the court, and then help to write opinions. I was struck when I read last week that Justice Alito had written 4 opinions for the court last term. I worked with the Chief Justice on 5 opinions that ended up as majority opinions for the court by myself. But it was one of the interesting things about Warren Berger is he took great pride in the fact that he took a full load of opinions for himself. I mean, he was in the majority. He could assign those opinions to whomever he wanted to, and he chose and he always kept about the same number, exactly the same number as the other justices. I mean, he tried to distribute them out. And if you take 160 and divide it by 9, it comes to around 17 or so opinions. And the chief consistently would write that same number of opinions. In fairness, he did probably ask Justice Rehnquist to write a few more dissents than he might have written. I mean, he could have distributed that a little more evenly than he did, but I don't think it was because of the workload. I think it was because Justice Rehnquist asked actually to write a lot of those dissents, and the chief was more than happy to defer to him on that. In terms of the workload, there's one other aspect of it that's a little bit unique to the terms prior, my term, previous ones, and I think one more after, is at the time the court didn't actually have any word limit or page or word limits on the briefs. So it was pretty common in big cases. So the Columbus and Dayton school busing cases, was an antitrust case involving I think it was CBS. I mean, the briefs would be 500 and 600 pages long. Now, you didn't get quite as many friend of the court amicus briefs in those days as you did now, because if the party briefs are 500 pages long, there's not a lot of room for amicus briefs, or at least less of a need for them. But everybody feels an obligation to read the party's briefs, including the chief. I mean, he always took the party's briefs. He would leave it to us to evaluate the amicus briefs and say, tell me whether is there something in there you really think I need to see. And as far as I can tell, every justice, both when I was there and since, has followed essentially that same basic practice. It's just, they don't want to read all of the amicus briefs in the first instance. They ask the law clerks to screen them out. But if you put it in context, 155, 160 cases, that's 4 oral arguments a day for every day that the court was sitting. Then the court in the chief's time, when they had conferences tended to last 6, 7, 8 hours even. I know Chief Justice Rehnquist changed that practice and significantly shortened it. But just taking the law aspect of what the chief did, it was was pretty breathtaking. And I know he took it very seriously because before each of the oral arguments, he didn't bring us all, the three other law clerks. He didn't ask us generally to come in and have a conversation and give a take among the four of us. He would have each of us come in and individually talk to him about our case. We had presented him with a bench memo explaining how we thought the case probably should, how I would decide the case. That's really what the chief asked us to do. Tell me the first line of every memorandum that I wrote to him had to say, I recommend you do X. And whatever it happened to be. I grant the petition, deny the cert petition, grant the extension of time, whatever. Join Justice Blackmun's opinion, don't join Justice Blackmun's opinion. But that was your first sentence of every memorandum had to be your recommendation for what you wanted the Chief Justice to do. And then when the time came to sit down and talk about the cases, you would talk. The chief would obviously had studied my bench memo thoroughly. He had obviously read all of the parties' briefs. He knew the issues well. At that stage, he'd been a U.S. Court of Appeals judge for a significant number of years before he went on the court. He was a little more than halfway through his tenure on the Supreme Court the year that I clerked. And I marveled, frankly, at how much work he did just to be a justice. I mean, I marveled how much work all of the individual justices did. But what really was more amazing to me was the chief, the chambers were physically showed that he wore two hats, right? He had his back office where we did legal work and where we met with him. And then there's the conference room, which is inside the chief's chambers. And then on the other side was what we call his front office, where he did the administrative tasks that the Chief Justice has. And I'll let Jim discuss more specifics about that. But the chief, I think he spent more time in the back office, but he spent a significant amount of time in the front office because he took those responsibilities seriously. And what amazed me even more is that almost every night he had to put on a tuxedo because he had some event to attend in connection with his responsibilities. And in the middle of all of that, there would be interruptions during the day when some delegation from another country of judges or justices or jurists or lawyers would come in, and the chief would take time to meet with them. And he was always incredibly gracious. I never had the impression that he was anxious about his time. When we were sitting there talking about cases, he viewed it as sort of my time, that we would have, take whatever time I needed in order to explain to him how I thought the case might come out. And he never expressed any kind of desire to kind of push me out. Now, I will admit there were a couple of times, right? Like you, Jim, I would go play basketball on the highest court in the land a couple times a week just to blow off steam in a job that was otherwise 7-day-a-week job. And I did end up on the elevator with him once coming down, and he got on the elevator and I looked like a drowned rat because I'd just come out of the shower, and he knew where I'd been, and he just looked at me and as I was getting off, he said, Carter, I assume I'll see that draft of the opinion and whatever the case was sometime either later today or first thing tomorrow morning. I get it. I owe you one. I will get it to you. No worries. But the other part of the clerkship that was particularly endearing and I think memorable for my colleagues and me when I was clerking was that most Saturdays the chief would invite us for lunch in the conference room, in the main conference room, and typically we would eat on the conference table, and lunch was always essentially the same thing. He had a huge pot of bean soup that was kind of stock bean soup, and then he just took whatever was in the kitchen and kind of threw it in as a kitchen sink approach to it and stir it up, and they'd bowl it out for us. He'd offer us wine, but since we were going to work the rest of the afternoon, we declined. The interesting thing about it was one of the obligations when you left your clerkship was you had to orient your replacement. It was important to explain to your replacement that the Chief Justice was likely to invite you to lunch frequently on Saturdays. That the kind of hitch in that was you had to be at your desk at 9 a.m. when his secretary was going to call you to invite you in order to accept the invitation. So it was sort of a two-edged sword because it guaranteed you were going to work every Saturday at 9 a.m. Might not always get the benefit of a free lunch, but more often than not, we did. But what really stuck out in my memory about the chief was he didn't talk a lot about time at the court during those lunch sessions we had together. He talked a lot about being a practicing lawyer in Minneapolis and what that was like, and encouraged all of us candidly to go, when we were done with our clerkships, to go back in, to go into private practice. Now I didn't. I went into teaching and eventually got to private practice, but I was probably a bit of a disappointment to the chief by going off to waste my life as an academic. But fortunately, I saw the truth before I went too far down that. But and then he would talk about his time when he was the assistant attorney general, head of the civil division of the Justice Department. And first of all, he said it was the greatest job in the world, much better than being a judge on the D.C. Circuit or being the Chief Justice of the United States, which is a little hard to accept. But I understand it was probably in a lot of ways kind of more exciting and certainly more active. And he talked about labor disputes and the opportunity he had to go and meet with President Eisenhower as part of the briefing process to explain about one of these labor disputes and a strike that was going on, and how he got his assignment and working orders directly from the president as to what the president wanted him to argue in the court, and he succeeded in getting an injunction. And so, and it was I don't want to say he was like a little kid, because I mean it's funny now. I noticed when we were preparing this, I mean, the chief was exactly the same age then that I am now. It's a little strange in my brain to kind of wrap around that fact. But when he talked about those days, there was a kind of just an energy and enthusiasm that he had for those experiences. Now, he talked about his life on the DC Circuit too, et cetera. But what really seemed to excite him was both what he did in private practice and what he did as a relatively young lawyer in the Justice Department. And then I'll end this segment of just saying, in terms of his importance to me, as Jim said, I did spend some time in the Solicitor General's office of the Justice Department, and my access to that job was dependent, as I was told later, on Warren Berger giving me a very strong recommendation that this wasn't just the check a box kind of thing. Larry Wallace, who was the deputy at the time, said, if the Chief Justice doesn't come out enthusiastically supporting your candidacy, we would have moved on. And just to give a little flavor to it, the person with whom I was competing for that particular job at the time was a little known lawyer then, a guy named Sam Alito. Yeah. So they were choosing between now Justice Alito and me for that job. So I think part of the reason I ended up starting work a little before Justice Alito did was because Warren Berger had said such nice things about the work that I had done. So I owe him. I mean, and the rest of my practice before the court really obviously stems both from that clerkship and then from the strong support he gave me to help me get into the job I got at the Justice Department. And then from there, I took his advice to go into private practice. I was just a little late in getting to that point. But
you made up for lost time, though, Carter, I think, quite well. You touched on so many aspects and triggered so many thoughts along the way of my experiences with him. I'll pause on a couple of those before I launch into some observations I might have about his administrative work. But one of the characteristics that I think all three of us can attest to is of Chief Justice Berger was his loyalty to those who worked for him and with him, and what he did for their careers. And he was very proud of him. I had conversations with him about you, Carter, and Claire, later in my career. Very proud of what his former clerks and people who worked with him over the years have done. They took great interest in it. I was interested, you've argued 90 cases before the court in your career, Carter, 9 of which the chief was participating in the court. Do you have any observations to make about that? And I assume he didn't rule in your favor in all of them.
Clearly he did not. I lost a couple of those cases 9-0, so he was squarely in the majority and in those decisions.
I just want to clarify what I meant by loyalty to his former clerks. It didn't affect his judgment.
But if you argue in the court, if you have the privilege to argue in the Supreme Court, that first argument in particular will always stay in my mind. And I was wearing my morning suit, which is not my normal attire then or now or any time in between. And I probably didn't have enough sense to be more nervous than I should have been. I was 29. That's my first court appearance. And the federal defender from Pittsburgh, it was just wrapping up his position because he was the petitioner in the case. I was representing the United States as the respondent. And there was a part of me that for a split second, when I knew that the petitioner was going to stop, to say, this would be a good time to run out of this building. And instead of doing that, I looked up at the chief, and he almost willed me up to the podium to begin my "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court" part of the presentation. And I'm going along with the argument just fine. And I think Jim knows this pretty well too, that Justice White took a particular interest when you had new lawyers showing up or rookies coming in to kind of give them a slightly harder time than he might give you if you'd been there 4, 5, 6 times, whatever. And he was asking me candidly some pretty hard hypotheticals about this criminal case I was working on. And I was about 5 hypotheticals deep into an exchange with Justice White, and seemingly kind of losing more and more focus on exactly what I was trying to get to. And the Chief Justice interrupted at that point and said, well, Mr. Phillips, let me ask you, how would you decide these facts? And so he gave me a new hypothetical, but the new hypothetical was exactly the facts of the case. So that hypothetical was, for me at least, quite easy. And I said, well, in that case, the United States clearly wins, Your Honor. and I had the sense that there was kind of some, maybe not actual exchange of glances between Justice White and the chief, but that there was kind of a message to Justice White that, Chief said, all right, you picked on this kid long enough. Let him get through the rest of his argument without falling over and fainting in the middle of it. I deeply appreciated that.
Right.
As it turns out, notwithstanding Justice White's fairly critical set of questions, he voted in favor of the United States in that case, as did the chief. I did learn later that Justice Stevens, who dissented in that case, actually went into the argument intending to vote in favor of the United States, but because of the Justice White's questions, they raised all kinds of issues in his mind, and he ended up doing some additional research and voted the other way. So best I could tell, I succeeded in losing a vote that I already had going into the oral argument. But so it makes it even more appropriate that the chief threw me a lifeline at that point, because God knows how many votes I could have lost if I kept responding to Justice White the way I was going down that path. But that was a very happy memory for me, just that wonderful moment when the chief made my life slightly easier standing at the podium.
Well, he was quite proud of your career. I know that.
One thing, let me just say one other thing that I should have said. But it came up sometimes in the lunches, but it usually came up more often than just meetings with the chief. I mean, he was really quite excited and enthusiastic about the Historical Society. I mean, I think it had been in place for about 4 or 5 years. It's not like he talked about it all the time, but at least on more than a half dozen occasions, either during the lunches or in one-on-one meetings. And he would talk about how the Historical Society was born. And at one point, he actually walked us around the court and bemoaned the fact that there was literally nothing to see in the halls of the court. And then he took us down where there were all these old portraits that were just sitting in the, I don't know what, sub basement of the court, portraits of the justices. And he said, this is a travesty. These things are just sitting here. They are rotting. We need to get this fixed. This is awful. And so, obviously that changed. If you go to the court now, it's actually a very nice place for tourists. Sadly, the pandemic put a little bit of a halt to that, but it is so much more appealing as a place to visit and to get an opportunity to understand how the court does what it does, rather than just show up, see these incredibly blank halls and a very austere environment where you kind of come away. You may be a bit awed by it because of the austerity, but it's also not exactly warm, welcoming. I'd say that it certainly wasn't then, but it is now, much more so now.
Thank you for that, Carter. I do want to ask Claire more about the origins of the society. And before I get to that, I just want to insert an observation about, again, his workload and your comments, Carter, about the 2 offices, the 2 chambers he had around the conference room, one in which he did his work on the cases before the court, and the front office in which he did more of the administrative work. But I want to, and in part, I want to circle back on to what you said about it. He didn't interview the law clerk candidates himself, and people will understand why that was the case when I described to you what all he was doing at the same time. He was working on these 165 cases in oral argument a year. The amount of work and devotion of time he spent on administrative matters is really truly remarkable, and he really had 2 full-time jobs on that. And so he did delegate on the law clerk interview process to a committee of clerks that he held in highest regard, and they did a fine job, as is evidenced by their selection of you, Carter, but and many others. But they did a fine job of knowing what he was looking for in a clerk, knowing the workload that he had and who would work well together with him. And so that all worked out quite well. The administrative work. Judicial Conference of the United States meets twice a year. It's a body of 26 federal judges, 13 chief judges from each circuit, 13 U.S. District Court judges from each one from one of those circuits. The Chief Justice presides as the head of that conference. In those days, the conference would meet on administrative matters and processes and procedures and policies for that's set for the entire judicial branch. They would meet 2 or 3 days for each session of their conference. Chief Justice Rehnquist and Chief Justice Roberts have narrowed that down quite a bit and get the work done on those conferences in about a day's time, usually. But they inherited a system from Chief Justice Berger that they were able to improve upon, I would say. And Chief Justice Berger was one of the first chiefs to lead the administrative aspects of the entire branch of the country. Before there was a Judicial Conference of the United States, and before there was an administrative office of the United States courts, the judicial branch was administered and managed by the executive branch of government, and until from the country's origin until 1849, the Department of Treasury oversaw the management of the federal judiciary. And then the Department of Interior took it over until 1870. And then it was handed off to the Department of Justice to manage the judiciary and judicial branch until 1922. It wasn't until Chief Justice Taft, who had been president before, recognized the importance of the courts and the judiciary managing itself and themselves, independent of, separate from the other two branches of government. So Chief Justice Berger was in the throes of setting policies for the court early on in that history of the judicial branch. But I want to, and I have to write these down because it's just it's so lengthy that I couldn't commit them all to memory. But the administrative work that he did on behalf of the judiciary, outside even the work of the Judicial Conference of the United States, was really quite phenomenal. In addition, creating the Supreme Court Historical Society, and I want to come back to Clare on that, and a little bit on the history on that. But he also created the American Inns of Court, the Institute for Court Management, the National Center for State Courts, the National Institute for Corrections, the National College of the Judiciary, State Justice Institute. He established what's now known as the Supreme Court Fellows Program, and he was very involved and ahead of his time, frankly, on prison reform. He had a notion, and he learned it from, I think, his roots overseas. I think it was either Sweden or Norway that had what he called factories with fences, in which those who were serving time in prison were taught a skill while serving time in prison so that they could be employable at the end of their imprisonment. And it was an effort to reduce recidivism for those coming out of prison. So he was ahead of his time on that, but where he found the time to do all these things is really quite remarkable. Clare, I wanted to ask you about the creation of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and also the curator's office of the court. And Carter has made the observation, and even in those days, in the late 70s, the court looked quite different on the ground floor as far as what the public saw when they entered the building than it does today. And Clare, you've had played a great role in the evolution of that. Can you tell us about your when you were hired and the work you've done in that capacity?
Sure, sure, Jim. Yeah, let me just get to start with the origin though, because we can't really understand the Supreme Court Historical Society unless we talk about the creation of the curator's office at the court. So as Carter said, Berger looked at his own building and realized that it was, it was a functional working courthouse, but that the history of the Supreme Court had been neglected. And so in 1973, which was the same year he founded the Judicial Fellows Program, he hired the first curator, Kathy Skifos, to catalog, preserve, and display many of these documents, artifacts, furniture, paintings that had all been stored in the basement or sub-basement, as Carter said. She was also tasked with organizing the first exhibit in the hallway of the court. It was on John Marshall, to educate visitors coming to the court. So Berger was very much aware of wanting the experience of people coming into the building to be educational. Kathy Skifos was followed by Gail Galloway, who served as curator from 1976 to 2002. And they really transformed it from a working courthouse to a building with a professional curatorial staff that did educational outreach. So the question is, why was Berger the first Chief Justice to see the need for that? And I think it goes back to the fact that he himself was an artist. He really cared about art and artifacts and antiques. He also loved history. So to get to your question about this is Historical Society, because it's our 50th anniversary and this webinar is kicking off our year-long celebration. The society was founded in November of 1974, so after the founding of the curator's office. And it was really to support, well, I should say that Berger was very mindful that the White House Historical Association and the Capitol Historical Association had been founded in 1962 and 1963 as ways to raise private funds to support those, the other branches' collections and curatorial programs. And he thought that the judicial branch should have a similar setup. He was, I think, as Jim has said, very mindful about the judicial branch being co-equal to the other branches in every way. So the society's mission, of course, was to preserve the history, but also to put on lectures, develop publications to interest the general public. He wanted it to be scholarly and support new scholarship through the yearbook, which is now called the Journal of Supreme Court History. The Documentary History Project was launched early on. But when getting back to me, he wanted to have a publications director who could develop books that were really aimed at mainstream audiences. So not the law review crowd, the constitutional law crowd, but really sort of messaging why the Supreme Court is so important in American life. So I was hired from National Geographic to develop this program. I'm enormously grateful to Warren Berger for selecting me and launching my career. I think what Jim really wants me to tell you is that I later found the memos about my hiring, and apparently what they were really looking for at National Geographic was an editor who is young, good, and cheap. So as you can see from my white hair, I'm no longer young. I think I'm still a relative bargain.
So good.
A great bargain. We're all, we're glad he had such good judgment in hiring you, Claire. It is remarkable to see the difference. And I started working in the court in 1975 in his chambers. And the society had just been founded. The curator's office was just early stages. And so I had seen it even 3 years before Carter started as a clerk. And it was more empty then when I started than it was when Carter started. But today it's really quite a beautiful display of history and exhibits, and they're interactive, and I encourage everyone in the audience to please go take a look. It's well worth it, and the visit to the court.
And if you do, stop by the gift shop for the society.
Yeah, very good. You're going to be a very good president.
Get yourself a souvenir.
We have questions from the audience that I want to get to, but before doing that, and the time has just flown by because there are a couple other topics I had on my outline to get to, including some of our own personal interactions with the chief and some of his personality traits. I'll just mention one before we turn to a couple other topics here and the audience questions. He was, what always struck me is no matter how busy he was, he really had a sense of he was devoted to preserving not only the history of the court, but the building itself, and he took great care of it. He was also very frugal. And he would make the rounds around the building. If he would see lights on in a part of the building that was not being utilized, that didn't need any light at the moment, he would not only would he turn them off, he'd make a sign. He'd write handwritten signs, turn off that light, and tape it up above the light switch in areas of the building which didn't really require light 24 hours a day. And so that I always that must have come from his background and growing up and being very careful with funds that were needed. He was very frugal that way with regard to the court's budget as well. Carter, I want to, before we get to a couple questions we have from the audience. I wanted to ask you about work on a biography for the Chief Justice. There are no biographies yet, Chief Justice Warren E. Burger, and we need one. And can you give us an update on that?
Well, as I have commented on more than a few occasions in the past couple of years, it does seem to me a bit of a tragedy that we do not have a biography of Warren Burger when we have biographies of all of the other Chief Justices of the United States, including several of John Roberts, the current Chief Justice. And I don't begrudge the biographies that have been written about others, but I do think it would be nice to have a scholarly, neutral description of the Chief's life that includes an understanding of his background and the extraordinary effort that he put in both before he became the Chief Justice and after he became the Chief Justice. The Historical Society has graciously agreed to serve as a conduit for the collection of money to assist in the biography process. And where that part of the obstacle was the Chief Justice was certainly put off some by the immediate release of the papers by Justices Marshall and Blackmun. And so as a consequence of that, he stipulated in his will that his papers would not be available until more generally until I think it's 10 years after the last justice with whom he sat has passed away. That was Justice O'Connor, who we all know sadly passed away last year. And so that time is running. Now there are a couple of scholars who have had an opportunity to get access to the Chief's papers, William and Mary and elsewhere, and they are working diligently to get through them. But not surprisingly, in a career as diverse as the Chief's was, and for as long as it was, those files are voluminous. There are tons and tons of materials. They're working very, very diligently to get through them in order to put together, hopefully, a comprehensive picture. I'll say as a personal matter, others may have a different take on it, but the part that I suppose disappoints me the most is that at least some portion of the Chief Justice's public persona and perception come from the Brethren, which at the time was sort of a startling book because it was the first time law clerks had said much about their year with the court. And some portions of what were written there, when I clerked, that was not one of the terms that the Brethren was aimed at. So I don't know directly how it played out. Some things they've written certainly resonated with me. Some things seemed completely implausible to me about the Chief. And some of them I just know are not fair descriptions of at least the man that I knew. And I'm hoping that the public perception of the Chief Justice will be altered and hopefully to favorably toward him by a biography. And we're doing what we can to get that done sooner rather than later. The one thing I was going to show is that this is actually a book the Chief gave me. Now the ones I didn't bring because I found out that they are in a safe deposit box that my wife has placed them in are the ones that he actually signed, which are gifts now for my daughter and son. So those she's holding on to them so they don't lose them. But no, the Chief was fond of giving us the Constitution, and one of the great sacrifices I think he made was to leave the position as Chief Justice to take on the leadership of the Bicentennial Commission to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Constitution of the United States. That was, how do you know when to walk away from being a justice on the Supreme Court? And, who knows? But at least I thought the Chief did it about as graciously and elegantly as it can be done. And in terms of serving the public good, which he obviously devoted his entire professional life from the point, at least when he came to DC on, it's hard to see a more selfless act in taking on that responsibility and giving up the Chief Justice.
Carter, thank you for that. You've actually answered a couple of questions that we have received from the audience about the Chief's role on the Bicentennial Commission. I would just add to that I think it was really a continuation of his life's work, what he thought about the importance of the Constitution and the role of the judiciary in a constitutional form of government, and the importance of an independent judiciary in the role. And he took that as a retirement job by taking on the leadership of the Bicentennial Commission. So he was devoted to it. Two questions here. One, I think, is appropriate for Carter, one for Clare. The first being, did the Chief Justice ever talk to you about influences on his judicial philosophy? Teachers, other judges or justices or experiences? That's a Carter question. And then for Clare, to what extent have chiefs and associate justices affected the Historical Society? Have any of the current justices contributed objects, papers for the collection? So Carter, how about you take on the question on if the chief ever talked to you about influences?
Yeah, well, I mean, we didn't talk philosophy specifically in particular, but the chief did oftentimes make references to Justice Harlan, the second Justice Harlan, with whom he sat in his early tenure as the Chief Justice. And, you know, the chief was fond of saying that less is more oftentimes, and that the court should take an incrementalist approach to decision making and not decide more than what is in front of the court in any particular case. So I would guess if I were going to pick a justice who probably influenced him as much as anybody, it would have been Justice Harlan. You know, he and some of the other judges on the DC circuit kind of butted heads. So I mean, I suppose his judicial philosophy, in some ways, may have been a bit of a anti-reaction to at least some of his colleagues on the DC circuit. But you know, again, it's so interesting about him. He never said a negative word about any of them. I mean, he admitted he disagreed with them, and particularly on certain issues on criminal law questions. But he was always so courteous. There was a calm to him that's almost preternatural, frankly, under the circumstances, because there were so many. I mean, I know that the court's viewed as very divisive, but there's so many issues and so many different spends, and you know, and so much work to do that you could envision somebody just losing it, not regularly, at least on occasion. And I just never saw that with him. It's up to me, at least, it was a marvel that he could hold himself in the way he did, and show up every day working at least 6 days a week, and oftentimes 7 days a week.
Thank you, Carter. And Clare, to what extent have justice chiefs and associate justices affected the society? Have they contributed the objects and papers for the collection?
Well, the short answer is not really. The justices' papers do not come to the society or to the court. They go elsewhere, mostly the Library of Congress. There have been some things that have been donated. I'm not aware of any off the top of my head recently. But what I would like to say is that we are going to have a November webinar as part of our 50th anniversary celebration. And we'll be talking to Matt Hofstad, the curator of the court, and some of his staff. So I will have a much fuller answer at that juncture.
October, yeah, I think that's right. Last question here. Are homes of former justices in DC identified as historic?
That's got to be a question for Clare.
I think some of them are, but not necessarily because a Supreme Court justice lived there.
Yeah.
They're historically preserved for various reasons.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the justices' homes have fallen into disrepair. I was just recently looking at William Rufus Day's house up near Howard University, and it's really run down. So the answer is there have been a lot of justices, and there are a lot of different answers to that question.
Jim, you may know the answer to this. I thought the chief's property in Northern Virginia, think it was in Arlington. I thought that was sold, and I don't know whether the original house where they lived survived that or not, but I thought it was sold and subdivided into a lot of different houses. Do you know that? Do you know if that's true?
Yes, the Chief Justice's home in Arlington where he lived was sold. I don't know exactly what happened subsequently to the land.
It was that big. It's, I went out there a couple of times, once on business to take something to him, and once just because he invited us out to have a nice meal with his wife and all the law clerks. And it seemed breathtakingly beautiful at the time, and I've gone by that area since, but I don't think the original house is still there anymore.
Yeah. He loved gardening, I know that. Well, we have reached the end of our time on the topic, although I think each one of us could go another hour on Chief Justice Berger, and very grateful for your time, Carter and Claire, on this. It's been we've enjoyed preparing for it. We've triggered so many memories each of us have had. So it was a very special day for us, and a very special topic. We're grateful for Chief Justice Berger's creation of the Supreme Court Historical Society, and we'll continue to work on fulfilling the mission he set for us. I think it's somewhat instructive that someone at Carter's background and career would take on to be president of the Supreme Court Historical Society after all he's accomplished, and I can only attribute that to his inspiration for what the Chief Justice meant to him, how important this was to Chief Justice Berger, and I feel the same way about it. At this stage of my life, he was very loyal to those who worked for him and helped us in our careers. And Claire, you've been with us since 1990, so that also speaks well for your devotion to the mission for the society. If you would like to see more about our work and the celebration of our 50th anniversary, you may like to see the 10-minute video on our website at www.supremecourthistory.org. A survey will go out later this afternoon to everyone who registered in advance. Please do respond to it. We added these virtual programs during the COVID pandemic, and we plan to continue them. Your feedback on these are critical in making them as informative and as engaging as possible. Our next event on the Society's virtual calendar is the Society's Constitution Day lecture on September 17th, in which Judge John Newman and Professor Marin Levy will be discussing their new book, Written and Unwritten: The Rules, Internal Procedures, and Customs of the United States Courts of Appeals. Registration will be open on the Society's website next week. And with that, we thank you all for joining us, and we are adjourned.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Carter. Thank you, Claire.
Thank you, Tim.